Officer Daniel Stone, a white cop, was cruising through the streets of a major city on his routine patrol, radiating an air of superiority. He felt untouchable, accustomed to wielding his power without fear of consequence. As he drove, his thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of a luxury car speeding past him. Instinctively, he decided to pull it over. When he saw a black woman behind the wheel in an upscale neighborhood, his baseless suspicions began to rise. Daniel approached the car with an authoritative swagger, ready to intimidate the driver. However, when he looked through the window, he was met by the elegant and composed presence of the woman, who held his gaze with a disarming calmness. Daniel demanded her documents, speaking with a tone of disdain, implying that someone like her had no business driving such an expensive car. His racist remarks flowed easily, questioning whether she truly owned the vehicle. Despite the verbal attack, the woman remained composed, responding with only a few words and handing over her documents without hesitation. Daniel, however, didn't stop there. His verbal abuse continued, completely unaware that the woman he was humiliating was the wife of his new boss, Captain Marcus Lowe. She didn't reveal her identity, calmly enduring the encounter, knowing full well that this incident wouldn't go unpunished. The sound of sirens echoed through the city, constantly reminding everyone of the power Daniel Stone carried. As he drove his patrol car, he did so with his usual confidence, eyes scanning for any sign of disorder. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the busy streets. For Daniel, it was just another day. He was used to the rhythm of his patrols and the sense of superiority his uniform gave him. The patrol car rolled into an upscale neighborhood, where wide streets and immaculate gardens surrounding luxurious houses reflected the high status of the residents. Daniel didn't usually patrol this area, but with a slow day ahead, he decided to kill time before his shift ended. As he turned a corner, a black luxury sedan caught his eye. It was driving slightly over the speed limit, not enough to be alarming, but enough to prompt Daniel to follow it. As he got closer, he noticed the driver was a black woman, dressed elegantly. His thoughts shifted almost automatically. What was she doing here? But there was nothing wrong with the scene except for the prejudice Daniel carried deep within. Without thinking, he turned on his lights and made the stop. The car slowed and pulled over to the curb. Daniel stepped out of his patrol car with firm, deliberate strides, adjusting his belt where his holster rested. As he approached the vehicle, he purposely knocked on the window harder than necessary. The woman, with measured movements, rolled down the window, revealing a serene gaze that contrasted sharply with Daniel's aggressive tone. "License and registration, please," he ordered coldly, showing no sign of politeness. The woman looked at him for a brief moment. Her eyes were calm, yet there was something in them that unsettled Daniel. She handed over the documents without a word, and he noticed that her hands didn't tremble, something he was used to seeing in others when they were under his scrutiny. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Daniel asked, narrowing his eyes as he examined the documents more closely than necessary. The woman maintained her calm posture, responding in a firm, controlled voice, "No, I don't. I was driving within the speed limit." Her confident response seemed to bother him. Daniel was used to seeing fear, nervousness, and submission. But this woman, who did she think she was? His gaze lingered on the documents, searching for any mistake, any excuse to continue his aggressive questioning. Officer Daniel Stone was determined to maintain control of the situation. When he found nothing wrong with the documents, he decided to change tactics. "Nice car. Are you sure it's yours?" he asked, a crooked smile playing on his lips, as he insinuated something already clear from the way he had approached her. "Yes, it's mine. I bought it with my money," the woman replied, never breaking eye contact. Her words were simple, yet they carried a silent challenge that Daniel wasn't prepared to face. The calm confidence she exuded unsettled him. He decided to test her further. "Is that so?" Daniel replied, a mocking tone creeping into his voice. "I didn't know this neighborhood was getting so many visitors lately." He gave the car an exaggerated once-over, as if inspecting it for any sign of illegitimacy. "Do you live around here, or are you just passing through? Because, to me, you seem a bit out of place." The woman, sensing Daniel's intentions, responded calmly, "I'm heading home. I've lived here for 3 years." She nodded toward one of the streets ahead. "My house is just down there." Daniel glanced in the direction she pointed. There was nothing specific about the area to justify continuing the stop. Yet, driven by a silent, simmering anger, he refused to let it go. He leaned on the car, getting close enough for the woman to smell the coffee on his breath. "You know, it's easy for someone to mistake a car like this," Daniel began, his tone laced with disdain. "You understand, right? People like you don't usually drive around here in something like this. Maybe you're doing something you shouldn't be." The woman frowned slightly, but her composure remained unshaken. "People like me? And what exactly does that mean?" Her directness caught him off guard, but the challenge in her eyes was unmistakable. She wasn't playing Daniel's power game. He sneered and stepped back from the car, his voice dripping with contempt. "You know exactly what it means," he replied dismissively. "Let's see, where do you work? Maybe I can call your employer and check if you're telling the truth. It wouldn't be the first time I've caught someone making up stories around here." The woman took a deep breath, controlling the anger that was starting to rise within her. "I'm an attorney, if that's what you want to know. I work at Benson and Leon on Main Street." Daniel recognized the name of the firm immediately. It was one of the most respected law firms in the city, and the revelation only deepened his frustration. She had an answer for everything, and nothing he said seemed to have an effect on her. "An attorney, huh?" Daniel scoffed. "You must be one of those who defends people who break the law. Well, let's see how you do when you're on the other side." He stepped back from the car, grabbed the radio, and pretended to speak into it. "I need a background check here," he said in a formal tone, but his intention wasn't to verify anything. He just wanted to intimidate her, to make her feel cornered. The woman remained unflinching, crossing her arms and leaning slightly back in her seat. "I've already told you my documents are in order. There's no reason for this stop to continue," she asserted, her tone calm and collected. "I'm willing to cooperate, but I won't accept being treated with disrespect." Her calm demeanor only irritated Daniel further. "You're pretty bold, aren't you?" he sneered. "This might not end well for you. I suggest you change your attitude before things get worse." He gave her a once-over, expecting her to back down, but the woman stood her ground. Her unyielding stance only fueled the silent rage building inside him. "Can I go now?" she asked sharply, her tone cutting through the tension and making it clear she was no longer willing to engage in this power struggle. For a moment, Daniel hesitated, taken aback by her composure. For a second, he considered continuing the confrontation, but something in her gaze made him pause. He found himself stepping back, though reluctantly. "Yes," he finally muttered, handing her back the documents. "But keep an eye out. We'll be watching you. Don't forget where you are, or who I am." She took the documents and, without another word, smoothly pulled away. As the car drove off, Daniel stood on the curb, watching it disappear down the road. For a few moments, he remained motionless, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. A strange frustration lingered inside him, a silent anger he couldn't explain. Something about that woman had irritated him, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. It was as if the encounter had left a mark he wasn't ready to face. When Daniel Stone got back into his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His heart was racing, and for the life of him, he couldn't figure out why. It hadn't been an unusual stop, but the way the woman had looked at him left him feeling unsettled. As he sat down behind the wheel, he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to brush off the sensation, but her words echoed in his mind, "I bought it with my money." That night, Daniel arrived home later than usual. Sarah was sitting in the living room, reading a book, barely looking up when he walked in. Their marriage had been distant for years, but Daniel had never cared enough to try to fix it. He didn't want to talk about his day, and Sarah didn't ask. There was a comfortable silence between them, but this time, Daniel's mind was elsewhere. He didn't know it yet, but at that very moment, the woman he had stopped was at home telling her husband what had happened, and her husband, the new boss, was about to set a plan in motion that would change Daniel's life forever. As the city woke up to another day, Daniel's mind was still stuck on the events of the previous night. He couldn't shake the memory of the woman's calm, unflinching gaze. Something about her had struck him deeply, leaving him with a discomfort that clung to his conscience like a thorn. When he arrived at the station, Daniel greeted his colleagues with a nod. He maintained the same posture as always, but inside, he felt a restlessness he couldn't explain. He sat at his desk, trying to focus on reviewing reports from the previous shift, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman. He kept thinking about the way she had challenged him without raising her voice, how she had refused to submit to his authority. His introspection was interrupted by a deep, firm voice behind him. "Stone, my office. Now." It was Captain Marcus Lee. Daniel looked up, surprised. Lee had recently taken command, and although Daniel knew little about him, he had already heard stories about his impeccable reputation and his insistence on maintaining order fairly. Lee's expression was unreadable, which made Daniel's heartbeat quicken. As he walked toward Lee's office, Daniel tried to imagine why he had been called. He couldn't think of anything specific, but the memory of the woman from the previous day unsettled him. When Daniel entered the office, he found Captain Lee sitting behind a large wooden desk, his eyes fixed on him as if trying to read his soul. "Close the door," Lee said in a tone that left no room for argument. Daniel obeyed, standing on the other side of the desk. The silence that followed was heavy, as if each second stretched on forever. Finally, Lee spoke, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "Yesterday, you made a stop on a luxury car in Pine Hills, correct?" Daniel nodded, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "Yes, sir. I made a routine stop. The driver was behaving suspiciously, so I decided to check it out." "Behaving suspiciously?" Lee repeated, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. "And what exactly led you to believe there was something suspicious?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, realizing there was no real justification for the stop beyond his own prejudice. But he couldn't admit that openly. "Well, sir, the car was slightly over the speed limit, and considering the time and place, I thought it might be prudent to investigate," Daniel replied, trying to maintain his composure. Lee remained silent for a few seconds, observing Daniel with a look that seemed to pierce through all his defenses. "Interesting," Lee finally said, leaning back in his chair. "Because, according to the driver's report, there was no infraction. And the stop was marked by a series of comments that, let's say, don't align with the standards we expect here." Daniel's blood ran cold. It wasn't common for a complaint to reach the boss so quickly, and he realized that this situation was far more serious than he had imagined. "With all due respect, sir," Daniel began, but Lee raised a hand, silencing him before he could continue. The air between them grew thicker as Daniel waited for the consequences of his actions to unfold. He had no idea how deep this would go, but he knew, instinctively, that it was the beginning of something that would change everything. "I'm not finished yet," Captain Lee cut him off, his voice still calm, but with a firmness that allowed no argument. "I want to make something very clear, Stone. I do not tolerate abuse of power in this department. I understand that the routine can be exhausting and that sometimes we make mistakes, but there are limits that should never be crossed." Daniel felt a wave of panic rising inside him, but he forced himself to remain firm. "I understand, sir. I just want to assure you that my intention was only to protect the community," he said, trying to sound sincere. Lee studied him for a moment longer, then stood up and walked to the window. He gazed out at the city for a few seconds before responding. "I hope so," he replied, his voice steady. "I'll be watching your actions closely from now on, Stone. This city needs officers who serve and protect, not those who intimidate and abuse their authority." He turned to face Daniel. "I'll be keeping an eye on you." Hearing those words, Daniel understood the gravity of the situation. A sense of paranoia began to settle in his chest, and he couldn't help but wonder how far Captain Lee would go. "I understand, sir," he said, maintaining his posture. "If there's nothing else, I'll get back to work." "Go," Lee said, turning his back. "But remember what I said, Stone. There won't be a second chance." As Daniel left the office, he could feel the weight of Lee's warning pressing down on him. The captain's words echoed in his mind, amplifying his anxiety. It felt as though he was under constant surveillance, and the pressure began to mount. He returned to his desk, but the unease was all-consuming. He tried to focus on his work, but the feeling that he was being watched wouldn't let him be. From that moment forward, Daniel knew he would have to tread carefully. Over the following days, Daniel began to notice something unsettling. Lee was indeed keeping a close watch on him. Whenever he made a stop, there was always a colleague nearby, observing his every move. The report seemed to be scrutinized more carefully than ever before, and Daniel felt like he was being trapped in a game where the rules had shifted, and he no longer knew how to play. Meanwhile, memories of the woman he had stopped continued to haunt him. It wasn't just the encounter itself, but the way she looked at him, the way she refused to yield. Her calmness disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. He found himself replaying the moment in his mind, wondering if he could have done more to intimidate her, how he could have asserted more control over the situation. But deep down, he knew any misstep could cost him everything. Lee was not an ordinary boss. His presence was commanding, and it was clear he wouldn't tolerate mistakes. Daniel felt as if he were walking through a minefield, where every wrong move could trigger a catastrophic result. At home, things weren't any better. Sarah seemed more distant than ever, and their few interactions were cold, almost mechanical. Daniel didn't feel like talking, and Sarah, in turn, appeared oblivious to his inner turmoil. He wondered if she knew about his affair with Claire, the wife of his colleague, but he never had the courage to ask. What had once seemed like an escape valve now only weighed more heavily on his conscience. The affair with Claire, which Daniel had convinced himself was a harmless distraction, had become a constant source of guilt. At the station, the days dragged on, each one more tense than the last. Daniel tried to maintain impeccable behavior, but the constant fear of being caught consumed him. It felt like he was a rat trapped in a maze, knowing that sooner or later, Lee would make his final move. And as the pressure mounted, Daniel began to realize that the only way out might be to quit, to leave the city, to start over somewhere where no one knew him. But he also knew that making such a decision required courage, something he wasn't sure he possessed. The sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting a golden hue over the city as the day came to an end. But for Daniel Stone, there was no peace to be found in the beauty of the sunset. Since his conversation with Captain Marcus Lee, a dark cloud seemed to hover over his life, bringing with it a sense of restlessness he couldn't shake. Every step he took, every move he made, was done with forced caution, as though one mistake could bring everything crashing down. And yet, there was something else gnawing at him, something he tried to ignore at all costs. His affair with Claire, the affair with his colleague's wife had become a heavy secret, a burden Daniel carried like an anchor around his neck. The thrill that once accompanied their secret meetings had morphed into a constant wave of fear and anxiety. He knew that if Captain Lee ever found out, it would be the end of his career, maybe even more. But what Daniel didn't know was that the captain was already one step ahead. That afternoon, after a long shift, Daniel received a message from Claire. She wanted to meet him, as usual, at a discreet hotel on the outskirts of the city. At first, Daniel hesitated. The risk seemed too great. But he needed that fleeting relief, that moment when he could forget the mounting pressure and the suspicions hanging over him. He told himself he could be careful enough. When he arrived at the hotel, Claire was already waiting in the room. She sat on the edge of the bed, her expression a mix of desire and concern. "You took your time," she said as Daniel closed the door behind him. "I thought you changed your mind." Daniel managed a smile, though it felt forced. "Things are complicated," he replied, sitting beside her. "I'm being watched closely. We need to be more careful." Claire sighed and leaned her head on his shoulder. "I know. I've been thinking a lot about it, but I can't stay away from you." Her words, which once would have filled him with selfish pleasure, now only added to his tension. Each time they met, it felt like the noose around his neck tightened a little more. "And your husband?" Daniel asked, trying to ignore the growing guilt inside him. "He doesn't suspect anything." Claire shook her head. "He's been so busy with work that he hardly notices I'm here." She laughed, but the sound was hollow, joyless. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest. More and more, he wondered if it was all worth it, if the risks he was taking made any sense. "We need to be smarter," he said finally, trying to sound commanding. "If anyone finds out, it will destroy my career. I can't let that happen." Claire looked into his eyes, and for the first time, Daniel saw something different there, a flicker of insecurity. "I don't want to cause you any trouble, Daniel," she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "But I don't want to lose you, either." "We'll keep going," Daniel replied, trying to reassure her. But deep down, his words were more for himself. At that moment, he believed he could still control the situation, that he could keep going without anyone finding out. What he didn't know was that Lee had already begun tightening the net. The next morning, when Daniel arrived at the station, the air felt different. There was an odd tension hanging in the hallway. He noticed his colleagues' glances seemed sharper, as if they were waiting for something to happen. As he walked down the corridor, he heard whispers, but the words were too muffled to make out. Something was wrong. When he reached his desk, he found a plain white envelope with no markings. Daniel picked it up, a strange sense of dread creeping up his spine. He opened the envelope with trembling hands, and when he saw what was inside, his heart nearly stopped. It was a photograph, one of him and Claire together, entering the hotel. The world seemed to spin around him. For a moment, he wondered if it was real, if someone knew, if someone had found out. He looked around, trying to identify who might have placed the photo there, but everyone seemed oblivious, focused on their own tasks. Daniel quickly put the photograph back in the envelope and shoved it into his desk drawer. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what to do. As he struggled to keep his composure, the phone on his desk rang, cutting through the silence. "Stone. My office. Now." Captain Lee's voice was as cold and authoritative as ever. Daniel's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. As he walked toward Lee's office, Daniel felt like he was heading to his execution. Each step felt heavier than the last, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. When he entered, he found Captain Lee sitting behind his desk, his eyes fixed on Daniel with a calculating expression. "Close the door," Lee said without looking up. Daniel obeyed, his stomach churning as he stood on the other side of the desk, the tension in the room suffocating. Standing by the desk, arms crossed, the envelope lay on the surface, the photo visible beside it. "Close the door," Lee said, his eyes never leaving Daniel. He obeyed, his throat dry. "I told you there wouldn't be a second chance, Stone," Lee began, his voice low but filled with an implacable authority. "I expected you to take that seriously." Daniel tried to speak, but no words came out. He felt like a trapped animal with nowhere to run. Lee picked up the photo and held it up, as though examining it for the first time. But Daniel knew that wasn't the case. "I knew something was off about you. Your behavior at work was already problematic, but this is something I can't ignore." "Captain, I can explain," Daniel stammered, his mind racing for an escape, but Lee cut him off immediately. Explain what exactly? Do you plan to explain that you betrayed a colleague? That you got involved in an affair that puts your entire career and the trust of your partners at risk? Lee's voice rose with each word, making it clear he had no interest in hearing excuses. It was a mistake, Daniel stammered, feeling the pressure mount. It won't happen again, I swear. Lee stepped forward, getting closer to Daniel, who instinctively backed away. A mistake that could ruin not just you, but everyone around you. This isn't just about you, Stone. You should know that. Lee's tone was icy, but there was a spark of something deeper, something Daniel couldn't quite identify, which made him even more apprehensive. I could destroy you right now, Lee continued, lowering his voice slightly. I could end your career, your life, everything you know. But I'm not going to do that. Not yet. Daniel's eyes widened in confusion. I'm going to give you a choice, Stone, Lee said, his gaze sharp. You're going to redeem yourself. You'll do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. And maybe, if you do everything right, you'll get out of this with some dignity. Understood? Daniel nodded quickly, fear gripping his entire body. Yes, sir. I'll do whatever it takes. Lee didn't smile, but his expression seemed to lighten slightly, as though he had gotten what he wanted. Good. Now get out. And remember, I'm giving you a chance that many wouldn't have. Don't waste it. Daniel left the office as if he had just narrowly escaped a death trap, but deep down, he knew he was more trapped than ever. The days following that conversation in Captain Marcus Lee's office were the longest of Daniel Stone's life. Every minute seemed to drag on as the pressure mounted. He had committed to obeying, but the constant fear that his life could fall apart at any moment left him teetering on the edge of despair. The silence he once found comforting at home now suffocated him. Even his meetings with Claire, which had once been an escape, were now tainted by the terror of being discovered. At the station, Daniel was constantly on edge. He knew Lee was watching his every move, and the constant surveillance made him feel like a puppet with the captain pulling the strings. He tried to maintain his routine, but every step, every decision, felt as if it were being judged, tested, each one carrying the looming threat that everything could come crashing down at any moment. A week after their last conversation, Lee called Daniel into his office again. This time, the captain's expression was more serious, as though he had made a decision that could change everything. Stone, Lee began without preamble. I have a mission for you. Something that will prove whether you deserve the second chance I'm giving you. Daniel's heart raced. A mission. He tried to remain calm, but the fear that Lee was setting him up was palpable. What do you need me to do? He asked, trying not to let his anxiety show. Lee stared at him for a long moment before responding. There's an operation underway. We're investigating a drug trafficking network with ties inside the police force. I need you to go undercover and find out who the accomplices are. Your mission is simple: gain their trust and bring back the evidence needed for a conviction. Daniel remained silent, absorbing the words. A dangerous mission. He felt his pulse quicken, realizing the gravity of what Lee was asking him to do. He was about to be thrust into a situation where his survival depended on how well he could play the game, and how much risk he was willing to take. The mission ahead would put his life at risk, and Daniel knew he had no choice but to follow through. Lee understood this, and Daniel recognized it as a way to keep him under control. Understood, sir, Daniel replied without hesitation, knowing that any sign of reluctance could be fatal. You'll be working with narcotics agent Tom Carter, Lee continued. He's already embedded in the group and will introduce you as a new recruit. This is your chance to prove you can still be trusted. Tom Carter was known for being a tough but fair cop. Daniel knew him by sight, but they'd never worked directly together. What Daniel didn't know was that Carter was also aware of everything that had happened to him and that Lee had instructed Carter to keep a close eye on him throughout the mission. That night, Daniel met Carter at a discreet bar in the city's suburbs, a place frequented by many of the drug network's contacts. Carter was a man of few words and even fewer friends. Without ceremony, he approached Daniel and sat next to him. "So, you're the new recruit," Carter said, not looking directly at him. "Yeah, seems like it," Daniel replied, trying to match Carter's casual tone. Carter glanced sideways at him, as if sizing him up. "Lee trusts you, so I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But don't think that means we're friends here. It's every man for himself. Got it?" Daniel nodded, aware there was no room for mistakes. "Got it. I'm here to help with whatever's needed." Carter took a swig of his beer before continuing. "We're meeting the guys tomorrow night. You're going to stay quiet and only speak when necessary. I'll introduce you as someone looking to get into the business. That's it." The next day, Daniel could hardly focus on work. The mission awaiting him that night consumed his thoughts. Fear and adrenaline mixed, creating a nauseating sensation that wouldn't leave him alone. He knew that if he failed, it wouldn't just be his career on the line, it could cost him his life. When night finally came, Daniel met Carter at an abandoned site on the outskirts of the city. The atmosphere was grim, and the surrounding darkness felt suffocating. Carter was with two men Daniel had never seen before, but it was clear they weren't strangers to the criminal world. One of the men, a burly figure with a scar across his face, looked at Daniel with suspicion. "This the guy?" the man asked, crossing his arms and giving Daniel a wary look. Carter nodded. "Yeah, this is Stone. He's reliable." The man didn't seem convinced but accepted Carter's word. "Well, we'll see what he can do. The next shipment's coming in tomorrow. We need someone to make sure it all goes smoothly." He turned to Daniel, his cold eyes assessing him. "You think you can handle that?" Daniel stood firm despite the weight of the man's stare. "Yeah, I can handle it," he replied confidently. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in the gesture. "Good. Let's see how you do." The night passed in a blur. Daniel followed Carter's instructions, observing every move, every word, trying to absorb as much information as he could. He knew that any misstep could be fatal, but he also knew that in order to complete the mission Lee had given him, he had to earn these men's trust. As the operation progressed, Daniel began to realize that the situation was far more dangerous than he had imagined. The trafficking network was far more organized and powerful than he had anticipated. There were cops involved, yes, but there were also outside forces, people from beyond the police force, making the situation even more complex. He found himself trapped in a web of lies and betrayals, where every wrong move could cost him his life. Each meeting with the traffickers was a test of nerves. Daniel tried to maintain his facade, but he knew he was walking a fine line. The fear of being discovered, along with Carter's constant surveillance, kept him in a state of perpetual alertness. During one of the meetings, the man with the scar looked Daniel over again. He was assessing him, and Daniel could feel the tension building. Each moment in this world was a test of trust, loyalty, and survival. And as much as he wanted to stay focused on the mission, he couldn't shake the feeling that every step was leading him closer to a point of no return. The man approached Daniel, his gaze even more suspicious than before. "You know, Stone," he began in a low, almost whispered voice, "I don't trust you. There's something about you that rubs me the wrong way." Daniel's heart raced, but he kept his composure. "I'm here to get the job done," he replied, trying to sound confident. The man stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he sized Daniel up. Finally, he backed off. "I hope so," he murmured before turning his attention back to Carter. Daniel could feel the weight of the man's distrust bearing down on him. He knew he was walking a fine line, and at any moment, he could be exposed. The stakes were high, and there were no guarantees that Lee would save him. After all, he was there to prove his worth, and failure was not an option. While Daniel dealt with the pressure of the mission, things at home continued to deteriorate. Sarah was growing more distant by the day, and their marriage, already hanging by a thread, seemed on the verge of complete collapse. Daniel knew he couldn't rely on her, but the loneliness made him even more vulnerable. The noose was tightening, and time seemed to be running out. He needed to find a way out of this situation, to complete the mission without losing himself completely in the process. But with each passing day, that seemed more impossible, and deep down, Daniel knew that even if he survived the mission, he would never be the same. The line between right and wrong, between justice and survival, was blurring, and he wondered how much longer he could hold on before breaking. Dawn found Daniel Stone in a state of mental and physical exhaustion. The weight of the mission, the sleepless nights, the constant tension of being exposed, everything seemed to pile up on his shoulders. He knew he was reaching his limit, but he also knew he couldn't stop. The mission Lee had given him wasn't just about proving his worth, it was a matter of survival. That morning, as he prepared for another meeting with the trafficking network, Daniel received a message from Lee. "We need to talk now." The words were direct, leaving no room for interpretation. A chill ran down his spine. Lee rarely summoned him directly, which meant something had changed, something serious. Daniel's heart pounded as he drove to the station. When he entered Lee's office, he found the captain standing by the window, the tension in the air palpable. "Captain," Daniel began, but Lee raised his hand, silencing him. "We have a problem," Lee said without turning around. "The man with the scar, Jake, he doesn't trust you, and to be honest, I don't blame him." Daniel's blood ran cold. He had known Jake was suspicious, but hearing it from Lee made the situation feel even more dangerous. "Jake's pushing," Lee continued, finally turning to face Daniel. "He wants you to prove your loyalty in a way we can't allow. They're planning a big job tonight, and Jake's going to demand you be part of it. If you refuse, it's over. If you accept, you'll be compromising your position and putting everyone at risk." Daniel felt the ground drop out from under him. "And what do you suggest I do?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lee stepped closer, his gaze hard as steel. "Stone, we need a way out. You're going to take part in the job, but we'll be ready to intervene. This will put everyone involved in custody, but for this to work, you'll need to play the game until the end." The idea of participating in an actual heist, even under police surveillance, made Daniel's stomach churn. He knew any mistake could be fatal, not just for him, but for the entire operation. But at the same time, it was his only chance to get out of this with some dignity. "Understood," he finally replied. "I'll do what needs to be done." Lee nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Stone, I know you've made a lot of mistakes, but this is your chance for redemption. If you succeed, you'll walk away with your career intact. If you fail, well, you know what happens." Daniel left the office with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Time seemed to speed up, as if he were being pulled into a vortex from which he couldn't escape. Night fell, and he prepared for what would be the most dangerous night of his life. The night that would change Daniel Stone's life forever had arrived. The meeting place was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where the shadows of rusted metal structures cast an eerie and grim atmosphere. The air was thick with tension, a sense of danger hanging in the night. Jake, the man with the scar, was in charge, and his piercing eyes never left Daniel from the moment he arrived. "Tonight, we'll see what you're made of," Jake said, a cold smile twisting his lips as he handed Daniel a gun. He briefed him on the plan. The heist involved breaking into a rival cartel's drug depot and stealing a massive quantity of cocaine. The operation was high-risk, lucrative, and potentially deadly if anything went wrong. Carter was present, his sharp gaze telling Daniel everything he needed to know. They were about to enter dangerous territory, and there was no room for mistakes. As they prepared, Daniel felt the cold weight of the gun in his hand, a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. He knew this was a pivotal moment, his life could change irrevocably, for better or worse, by the end of the night. When they arrived at the depot, the place was quiet, but the tension was palpable. Daniel followed the group, trying to appear calm, but each step felt heavier than the last. Jake led the way, moving with the precision of a man who had done this countless times. Every action was calculated, meticulous. The plan was unfolding as it should, until the silence was shattered by a distant sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, the unmistakable noise of sirens. Daniel froze. He knew immediately what it meant: the police had arrived. Lee had kept his word, the operation was being monitored. But before Daniel could react, Jake turned to him, his eyes blazing with suspicion. "Did you betray us?" Jake's voice was sharp, direct, like a bullet aimed right at Daniel's heart. In that moment, Daniel understood that his life was hanging by a thread. He raised his hands, trying to defuse the situation. "No, this isn't part of the plan," he said, trying to sound convincing. But Jake wasn't buying it. His gun rose, aiming directly at Daniel. The situation spiraled out of control in an instant. Carter, standing beside Daniel, acted swiftly. Before Jake could pull the trigger, Carter took him down with a single, well-placed shot. The sound of gunfire echoed through the depot, and chaos erupted. Lee's team stormed in, shouts and commands filling the air as they secured the area. Daniel hit the ground, heart racing, adrenaline surging through his veins. The gunfire ceased, and silence returned to the scene, broken only by the sounds of handcuffs snapping shut. Lee entered soon after, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Jake lay on the ground, handcuffed and unconscious, while other members of the gang were being taken into custody. Carter approached Daniel, offering a hand to help him up. "You okay?" he asked, his tone a mixture of concern and relief. Daniel nodded, still dazed from the chaos that had just unfolded. He could barely process what had happened, but the overwhelming feeling was relief that he was still alive. Lee walked over, his gaze assessing Daniel. "You did it," he said, his voice flat, with only a hint of acknowledgement in his tone. "It's over." But Daniel knew it wasn't over. The mission had been completed, but the emotional scars from that night would remain with him forever. As he looked around the room, seeing the men being led away in handcuffs, an emptiness grew inside him. He had survived, but at what cost? Back at the station, Lee called Daniel into his office one last time. The room was dimly lit, and for the first time, Daniel noticed the exhaustion in the captain's eyes. "You did what had to be done, Stone," Lee said, his voice weary but firm. "And because of that, I'm giving you another chance." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He knew he had managed to save his career, but the weight of what had happened still hung over him. The events of that night had broken something inside him that couldn't be repaired. "Thank you, Captain," Daniel finally said, his voice barely recognizable to himself. Lee's gaze remained serious. "Remember, this is your last chance. I won't save you again. Make it count." Daniel nodded, fully aware of the gravity of Lee's words. He left the office, his head hung low. He felt lighter, but the emptiness inside him was growing, a void that had been created by everything he had done and seen. The life he knew had changed irrevocably, and nothing would ever be the same. At home, Sarah was waiting for him. Her expression was unreadable, and Daniel knew that he would have to make peace with his past, with the choices he had made, and most importantly, with himself. But at that moment, all he wanted was peace, a brief moment of silence before the consequences of his actions caught up with him once again. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the house, and Daniel knew that the real work of rebuilding had just begun. The internal battle, the one he would face every day from now on, would be the hardest challenge of all.